Do onions make you cry on your keyboard? Well, it depends how well your recipe writing is going. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for curious writers, readers, and cooks. My name is Kate Leahy, and I'm here with Molly Stevens, Andrea Nguyen, and Kristin Donnelly. How is everyone today?
Doing well, Kate.
All right.
Good.
We're excited because we're talking about one of our favorite subjects, recipe writing, right?
It's what we live for, man.
That's why we got into this work, right?
It's what we do. Yeah.
One of the things I thought about in thinking about this episode was how we wanted to call it Why Onions Make Us Cry on Our Keyboards. And I can think of a few reasons why this might be the case, but why are onions so difficult when it comes to recipes? And not just because they make tears actually form in your eyes.
Well, I try to wear my contact lenses while I'm cutting onions. But aside from that, what vexes me about onions for every single book are onion sizing. What is a medium onion? What's a small onion? What's a large onion? What kind of onion? It just drives me cuckoo beans. And don't even get me started on shallots.
Shallots, because some of the shallots I've seen this year are the size of softballs. And I'm thinking, is that a medium onion or a very, very large shallot?
And you know what actually happens sometimes is things that are not true shallots, they're actually an onion that look like a shallot, but they're sold as shallots. So that's what makes it extra confusing.
And you would know because you spent a lot of time researching onions and shallots, all of those alliums, right, Kristin?
Yeah. So shallots generally always grow with like multiple bulbs attached. If it looks like it's probably just one bulb, like it was never attached to something else, it's likely an onion.
Oh my God, it's a wannabe shallot.
A wannabe shallot.
Well,
yeah.
Wannabe shallots. Dang. Oh, man, I think we just broke some ground right here on onions.
And then yellow onions, white onions, Spanish onions, sweet onions. Are you specifying? Does it matter every time?
Right. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then the chopping, like, this is where I get stuck because, you know, a lot of times I'm not doing a finely chopped onion. It might be calling for what technically would be like a half-inch dice, but then a half-inch dice sounds so darn fussy. But if you say roughly chopped, that implies to me like you're just hacking at it and it goes into stock. So like, what do you say? A lot of times I just say chopped and just let people figure it out. But, I don't know if that's the best thing to do.
This is why onions make us cry on our keyboards. We're not even near an onion when they make us cry. It's when we're staring at a Word document trying to make sense of how to tell people what to do with a frickin' onion in a recipe. So, okay, I'm going to get serious. This is really at the heart of what this episode is all about, and that is recipe writing and recipes and creating the best recipes you can. So today we're going to go through how to curate that awesome recipe list, how to write those recipes, develop those recipes, and test them, because developing recipes and testing recipes are different. So we're going to talk about why they're different. And sometimes recipes do make you cry, but if you have good systems in place, you can get through those setbacks. So I'm going to dive in here. The previous episodes, we've talked about making the deal. We've talked about writing a proposal. We've talked about getting an agent. And in that whole process, you had a recipe list. But when you finally have your deal signed, you actually have to face that recipe list and think, oh my gosh, is this the book that I meant to write? So, I just want to throw it to Andrea. When you had your proposalette, it gets greenlit. What do you do with that recipe list that you wrote maybe a few months before? Do you go back and assess, is this still the recipe list you want to create, or do you have new ideas?
Well, to tell you the truth, when I write a proposalette, I only have like the chapter outline. I don't have a table of contents. I know you guys are going to think I'm the bad, disorganized author, but I am a semi-organized person. I just want you to know that, because I make the excuse that the rest of it is all about creativity. And the creativity starts actually with fear after signing that book contract. And so when I look at the outline, I start with oftentimes the pantry, because I think that the pantry recipes are frankly the soul of a book. And then what can I do with the pantry recipes to build out the recipes from the rest of the book? And so my cookbooks are like driver's manuals. They're teaching tools. And so what can I do to use that recipe list to convey the lessons that I'm looking to convey across the board and help people be better cooks?
Andrea, when you say pantry, a lot of cookbooks have a pantry section where they say these are the things you need to buy or have in your house or have in your kitchen. But what I think I'm hearing you say is it's a little bit different in their pantry recipes.
Right. They're like, the go-to recipes that you need to make dumplings so that you just like have them within reach. Just sort of, I think of them sort of like a restaurant's pantry recipes, like they're not going to be like what every single cook's going to do. But if you've got some specialty item, you're going to reach for those things. Like with banh mi sandwiches, there are the pickles, and maybe you want to bake that bread, and then the cold cuts. Those are the pantry, the heart of what you can do to like just do that beautiful dance and turn it in all different directions to make that a lot of different recipes within the book.
Like building blocks.
Yeah. Oh, so well put. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're figuring out what those building blocks are, and you're mapping out the book after the proposalette is sort of been greenlit.
Yeah. And, and sometimes you guys, like the stuff in the pantry chapter gets dropped after a while because I'm like, oh, I only have them use it once. That's kind of stupid and useless.
That's actually a really good point. When you're looking at your recipe list, you also have to start thinking about the balance and how, like Molly, how do you balance out your books? Like your books can be quite long, and that's a lot of juggling and a lot of recipes to balance out. How do you do it?
Go back to what Andrea said. Fear is, I think, an operating principle here for a lot of this. And I do have a very detailed recipe list, table of contents when I write the proposal. It's in there. I don't want to say it goes out the window when I start actually writing the book, but it never looks like what the original proposal said. And this whole conversation makes me think of an interview I heard recently with Brian Ford. Brian is a bread baker, Instagram star, a blogger. He's had his own TV show, and he was talking about how stressful it was to write his own cookbook. He wrote a cookbook called New World Sourdough, and he was explaining how step one is realizing it's a daunting process. It's incredibly stressful. He described it as this danger zone where you're just overwhelmed by the prospect of writing a whole book. And I just thought it was a really good recognition of that first step, accepting that it's overwhelming to put the whole thing together and then getting down to work from there.
I see. So it's sort of when you get started, you're looking at the scope of a book and all the recipe components you need in it. But then at the end, you're also looking at the scope of the book and seeing where you can prune or modify or what's missing. So it kind of happens often, like throughout the process. It doesn't just happen once. I mean, Kristin, when you're working with a co-author, how do you work with them to balance that recipe list, curate those recipes, tell them you have too many sous vide recipes and not enough, Dutch oven recipes or whatnot? So what happens?
It is somewhat similar. You're looking at it from the beginning, but then also kind of have a check-in in the middle. And you'll say like, oh, yeah, we have too much of this technique, or we're missing something with this ingredient. I am such a spreadsheet person, so I organize everything in a spreadsheet and I create lots of fields. So the fields will be like the recipe title, but then it'll also have something like the potential chapter, the main ingredient. If the chapters are not like your usual starter, main, etc., then I'll classify them that way, as well as like the status of the recipe. So like, is it in development? Is it in testing? Has it been sent out? I'm just like constantly sorting that spreadsheet throughout the process. That also helps me see the balance.
That is awesome. I think that spreadsheet technique is really, really key, especially just to get the snapshot of your book as it progresses. I think actually I want your spreadsheet. I want to see that template. I'll have to ask you to share it. And so how did you figure out, was that something that came from your magazine development, or was that something that you came up with on your own?
I just like a good spreadsheet. And actually, I think for other books, I've worked within Microsoft Word, but more recently I've been using Google Docs. And then what's cool is you can, let's say if you're developing in Google Docs, you can then create a link in your spreadsheet that will link to your recipe. So that was another thing I did for myself, but also with collaboration. That way, when I'm collaborating, we always know we're working on the same document. And within Google, you can go back and see versions. So you're not afraid of like losing something because it never truly is lost.
the amount of time I've spent sorting out versions on a Word document. Is this version 1, 1.2? Someone's relabeling it something else. It's like on some file somewhere. Yeah, I can see the Google Doc process being so much cleaner.
If I'm working by myself, I will use Scrivener. It's a book writing tool.
I'm tempted to explore Scrivener. I'll have to look into that too, because I think, sometimes I think of, do I want to spend the time learning a new tool? But then at other time, well, it could save me time in the end if I actually learn how to do it. So it seems that when curating a recipe list, it's something that you do throughout the process. You have to go back to what your book is really all about and kind of make sure those recipes are really tying back to your theme. And that theme should have been pretty clear in whatever you pitched to your agent and your publisher. And if it wasn't, you're all of a sudden, this is now a sourdough baking book and I did not pitch it that way. Well, then you're going to have a serious conversation.
And I think as an editor pointed this out to me years ago that a book is not just a bunch of, it's not just a bunch of recipes. We talked about that a lot, right? And yet we start with recipes. And so for me, this process, it's sort of when you're trying to make a snowball, if the snow's not right, it won't hold together. And this beginning of a book project for me is that it's not holding together. It really is still just a bunch of recipes. And even though they're the recipes that were on this outline, they don't coalesce, they don't hold together. And then at some point in the process, and whether it's you have 15 recipes or 50 or 75, or it doesn't really, the number doesn't matter, but at some point it starts to coalesce, it starts to hang together and have this sort of life beyond, bigger than the recipes themselves. And then that's the feeling of like, yes, okay. And then you can start to build that thing and it will hold together. But for me, even though I've got a clear outline, a proposal, all those things, it still feels very like amorphous or uncertain at the beginning.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The recipes, you're in the weeds when you're coming up with the lists and you're developing them. But then there's a certain point where I'm just like, what the hell are you doing? And once the chapters start coming back and I can see so clearly that there is an arc, that there is a story I'm telling, that there is motivation in having this book in print, that I have something to say, then I'm like, okay, I'm there. And that's where that snowball is at the top of the mountain. And it's like downhill from there, right?
Right. That's like you're building your walls and you're building that house and you have maybe the furniture's all the recipes, but you're not going to just put all the recipes in the same room. So you got to figure out those rooms. And I think that kind of goes back to just the spirit of creating. Cookbooks really are creative projects, and you're not just curating recipes. You have to have that story arc. You have to have, as Andrea said in previous episodes, you have to have something to say. So while you're working on these recipes, you kind of start figuring out, this is what I'm really trying to say sometimes, right?
Are there certain kinds of recipes, ingredients that you guys like always feel like you need to include? It's not so much like it's low-hanging fruit, but it's like this is what people want to cook.
Chicken. I mean, if you're not doing a vegetarian book, it seems like people cannot get enough chicken.
Yeah, for me, it's salmon.
Salmon. Chicken and salmon. Things that are really easy and the things that you don't think people need recipes for, vinaigrettes. People love a vinaigrette. It's those little things that sometimes you take for granted that can actually help people buy into your book a little bit.
I was just thinking about how sometimes things seem so simple to me that they don't need a recipe. But if your reader is not like a professional cook, they often love those really simple things.
How important is it to think about who is cooking from your book? I mean, do you really have a good sense of who your readers are?
I do. I think about my sisters-in-law. I mean, that's kind of like, they're people who, there are a few of them, but they love to cook. They're good cooks, but they like a recipe. It's people who want a recipe, like you said. Maybe it's a recipe for a vinaigrette, and it's not because they can't create one on their own, but they like the inspiration that comes from finding it in a book. It's an idea. You flip open a book. What a simple recipe like that can do, it's inspiration. If you write it in such a way that you can actually teach something through the simplest recipe, then it's more than just a simple recipe for a vinaigrette for that night. You've maybe put in a little tidbit about the ratio in a vinaigrette and why you might want it a little richer or fattier for one dish and a little leaner and more acidic for another application. And so you can take something that is simple, but still use it as a lesson that gives your reader, your user, a little something to take with them besides just something good to eat.
How do you start writing these recipes that are going to push that snowball up the mountain? I'm curious to know if you go into the kitchen first and start cooking and start handwriting things down, or if you draft a document that's going to be the recipe, go into the kitchen, see if it works, see what you need to change, go back and forth. What is the process? Like, how do you actually, you have your basic recipe list that will probably change, but how do you actually start building out those recipes, writing down those amounts, figuring out what to do with the frickin' onions? Like, Andrea, what do? Do you start with a draft and then go into the kitchen, or vice versa?
My mind swirls because I do all of those things. It depends on the situation. Sometimes I dream or I simmer about a particular flavor or idea combination. Sometimes I'm thinking, oh God, I could like take that classic dish and I can like really twist it to make it, take that meaty thing. And I wonder if I can like make it vegetarian. And how would I do that? Well, let's say I'm taking a Vietnamese beef stew and wanting to turn it into a vegetarian dish. It's like, how would you make that meatless? It's built upon beef, right? This beef stew I'm thinking about. So then what can I do? And then I start thinking about that and simmering it. And then I'll jot down some ideas sometimes, but oftentimes I'll take the original recipe and then start plugging things in. Then once I'm in the kitchen, I'll start playing and writing down notes. And I keep notebooks that I jot things down. And I realize that over time, my handwriting has gotten kind of poor because I don't handwrite as much as I used to. But I try to have a skeleton down, but sometimes I just have notes down. And frankly, the written notes are the best because you can artistically draw on paper ideas that I think for me really works.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, Kristin, when you were doing Modern Potluck, what did you do for recipe development? Did you write them down first and then to start to tinker with them in the kitchen, or?
I think it's all of the above. There are things where it's like you start with an idea and then you're in the kitchen and the next thing you know, it becomes something else. It's a lot like the writing process. You sit down to write something and something else totally different and magical can come out. I like when I can work in a really disciplined way and sit down and write out what I think the recipe is going to be and actually type it on my computer, print it out, then test it out in the kitchen and make notes. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it really is just in the kitchen in the heat of the moment. I just know what I would do is I would give myself a deadline for, let's say, 10 recipes in a month, but how each of them came about during that month really varied.
And when you're working with a co-author, do you always have that document with the sort of skeleton recipe down first?
A lot of times they're doing a lot of work in the kitchen before they put it on paper. And then it comes to me and I go through a lot of questions with them. They'll answer those by doing more testing. And then we actually work with additional testers. At least for the co-authoring projects I've done, that's how it's been working.
So Molly, you're starting on, say, back in the day with All About Braising. Did you handwrite a lot of those drafts before you ever sat down on your computer and start writing down those recipes?
It's the same with everyone else. It's all of the above. You have, but I'm much more notes first and writing comes later. And it actually gets me into trouble sometimes because I think I'll remember things that I don't. But I've gotten better at that.
Well, let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that. What are the types of things that drive you nuts when you forget to write them down, all of you? I mean, that's one of the things that's like, oh, I thought I got that yield. Why didn't I write down that yield? I have this note that says yield.
Or I think that happens to me is if I'm not happy with something, I will have lost my momentum on taking the notes because I'm like, I have to do this over anyway. And I'm frustrated because, especially investment of time and money. And I really wanted to get it right because I've said I'd get 10 recipes done this month and I haven't or something like that. And so I'll put it away and come back and be like, oh, you idiot, like write it down. I've gotten much better at that though. But the other thing that I talk about is like, so I wrote a book on roasting, right? So it had to have a roast chicken in it, which I mean, talk about daunting.
Oh yeah.
There are so many roast chicken methods. And I think I have a folder that's about 2 inches thick on roast chicken. And I love research, which is part of why I do what I do. But so I just did all this research about roast chicken, various roast chickens. I had charts, I had spreadsheets, I had all the different times and temperatures. And I do all of that. And I'll do it for days, I'll do it for weeks, I'll do it for months, depending on what I'm working on. And then I put it all away. And then I just go into the kitchen by myself with my notebook. And then I start cooking. And then I'll come back with my own notes and compare them to what I found. And because I don't want that spreadsheet in the kitchen because I know that takes the soul out of my own cooking, that my own cooking has to be much more sort of intuitive. But so there is, especially I think the types of books that I've written, a lot of these things are classic recipes or standard recipes. So I'm not inventing anything new. That's a different kind of creation process, if you will, whereas you're standing at the market talking to someone, a farmer, and they start telling you something that they've done with this sorrel or rhubarb or whatever it is, and then you run home and try that. Those are both different ways to come at a quote unquote new dish or a recipe for your book.
I did have a question on roast chicken once, and I remember, Molly, I emailed you because I thought, what do I do? Can I stuff this chicken with this rice? Well, how do I make sure that like everything's at temperature? And you had so many great tips because you have all that experience with roast chicken. But what you all are talking about is really recipe writing doesn't have to be this clinical thing. This recipe development, doesn't have to be this kind of clinical process. You need to have fundamentals, but you can also be in the kitchen, really be focused on what you're doing, concentrate, and have inspiration come to you that way as well.
You're pointing out something, though, Molly, just about how recipe writing, development, et cetera, is so different from actually cooking in a way. Because when you're a cook, you can often just kind of like get into that zone where it's sensory and you're experiencing like the smells and that kind of joy, but you're not necessarily paying attention to like, what color do those onions need to be before you add this next ingredient? So there's like a next level of presence. And then remembering to record can often, I feel like, interrupt almost like that cooking process. And I have to say, I've had experiences where I'll cook something and it's awesome. But then sometimes when I'm going in to develop a recipe, it's like not that good. It's so frustrating. And I think sometimes that start-stop thing can get in the way.
Yeah, but I think that people need to also understand that when we develop recipes, we go through them multiple times. So that's like this rehearsal, and the final recipe that's in print is the performance. And that's your best that you've got to give. Mm-hmm. And people, assume that recipes are not original, that they can be copied, and they don't have that sense of specialness and originality that we're all talking about. And frankly, I just think that's just a bunch of hooey, because, you put your imprint on that roast chicken, Molly. Same thing with the Burma Superstar tea salad recipe, Kate, that you put together. And all the knowledge about alliums, Kristin. That's all original information. And so people can take a look at a recipe, and legalize it to death and say, well, all you did was say, stir in the sauce, whatever, stir in the ingredients. And there's nothing original about that. Of course not. But like in totality, that is original work, and it needs to be recognized. And that's work that, we've like honed before it gets to print.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, especially now that plagiarism is always a sticky subject in any kind of creative field, but it's definitely something that's been talked about a lot in recipes for many years. When do you know you need to attribute something to somebody else's creation in your own work? When do you kind of look at that balance to think, okay, I've got inspiration from this one recipe. It's my recipe because I'm changing things, but I know I need to give this other author attribution. How do you kind of strike that balance?
Well, it's funny. In Modern Potluck, I give a lot of credit because I was just finishing working at Food and Wine magazine when I wrote that book. So I had so much inspiration from like so many awesome people, so many people I had worked with over the years. And so I knew exactly where an idea came from. And a lot of times it was like, I was inspired by this person's this and this person's this, and I put them together. I remember somebody writing up about Modern Potluck, almost criticizing the fact that I give so much credit throughout. Like, I'd have to find it, but it was one of those things where I'm like, I feel like we should just give a lot of credit.
It's so in the spirit of potluck to do that too.
Yeah. I guess that's true. I guess that's true. But I also can see where when you're developing a dish like a roast chicken, thousands and thousands of roast chicken, and like maybe there's little pieces of inspiration coming from here and there, but it might be very hard to attribute it to like a single person or even a couple of people. In that case, you wouldn't necessarily attribute like to the 500 versions of roast chicken that you looked at before you did that recipe,
Right, exactly. Yeah. With my book Wine Style, I have a recipe in there that is not the recipe that I made while working at a restaurant called Terra in the Napa Valley. However, the idea for the dish came from, I remember we used to do this smoked salmon, this chilled angel hair pasta with smoked salmon, and we'd finish it with caviar. My recipe has nothing really to do with that, but there is that kernel of inspiration. And I thought it actually makes the head note make more sense in a way than just me putting this dish together. It actually has a little bit more character having that attribution. But it is a juggling act because at Kristin, it's like, well, these are your recipes. Even if you took an idea from this person and this person, you're creating this work. So I think it is a balancing act. I do think people are a little bit more wanting to see attribution than they maybe were back when Modern Potluck came out, though, too. I mean, Andrea, what do you think?
I think there's a difference between inspiration and information. And when you're researching a recipe, just like if you were doing a research paper, if you were reporting on something, you are researching and you're trying to trace down facts and you're trying to trace down information, and then you piece it together into something that is yours. That is doing research. That's a bibliography. That's a citation. It's different than, say, taking someone else's recipe and then making a few tweaks. That's like being inspired. And people also create recipes that are inspired by different cultures, and that's a totally different conversation for us to have. So I think that there is a difference between those two terms, and I take them very seriously because it's hard work to put an original recipe together. It doesn't come out of the blue. It takes research and it takes thought and care. It takes 2 inches of roast chicken recipes. And you know, Kate, like that cracker recipe that you have in the cover, wine style, that is so brilliant. I love that recipe. And I look at that recipe and I'm like, oh, that's a Kate Leahy recipe because she has like gone down the rabbit hole of dough and lavash and she put it together in this thing that I'm just like, I can throw that together and put it out there and have it with any kind of wine and snack that I want. And it's brilliant. You don't need to attribute anything to that except for Kate Leahy's experience as a writer and researcher and cook.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's true. I mean, we can't sell ourselves short. We need to attribute when it makes sense to, but also we know that a lot of hard work goes into these recipes. Do you save printouts just in case somebody came to you and say, hey, I think this is my recipe? And you're like, no, this is not your recipe because I have, all these printouts. I have this whole folder of all these drafts that I've done to get to the final product. I mean, do you all think of that kind of thing? Or maybe I'm just paranoid?
It's funny. I've never thought of that's why I save them, but I do for each. I have this system that I learned a million years ago where for each recipe I have a sheet protector. Every draft, every note, every testing note, everything ends up in that. So sometimes I have to expand the sheet protectors because it gets so fat if it's a recipe that's gone through many, many trials. But I keep them just for myself.
I love that.
Just during the process. It's like even during the editing and, all that, you come back and you have a question or, when I did the potato cookbook, the book went to print and there is a recipe in there for pum ano, which is a baked potato cake with no oven temperature in print. No oven temperature. Now, how many people looked at that? How many eyes? How many times we edited that recipe? These things happen. And onions make you cry. My God, everything makes you cry. When something like that happens, it's like, that is just so heartbreaking to have that happen. But at least I was able to go back and find it and, make an addendum. And what I wanted to say about attribution, and we're all cooks. We've been cooking however many decades. So all of our cooking is influenced by all the people we've cooked with, the people we've learned from, the books that we've read. So there's no way that you could, include all that in a head note. But I feel like in your heart, in your soul, if it's your recipe or if you're borrowing someone. I think there's just a certain level of integrity comes down to whether you call this your own or whether it is something that you want to say you've adapted it from somebody else.
Here's a situation that happened to me at one point. I worked on a short stack edition, these little, it was 20 recipes about a single ingredient, cool little pamphlets. I did one about cauliflower. And while working on it, I realized how much when cauliflower is blended with broth, it just behaves a lot like a bechamel. I touch on it in the short stack, but then I did some recipes for Serious Eats. That was like a vegan fettuccine Alfredo using the cauliflower puree and I think maybe some miso. I know I developed it in my own kitchen, put it up. And then somebody was like, this is so-and-so's recipe. And I go down the rabbit hole and I'm like, it is kind of similar to this woman's recipe. But I didn't even know it existed. And it was one of those things I'm like, should I have Googled this beforehand? Or her recipe had been up before mine. So I do think sometimes people come to things when there's something in the air, like cauliflower has been in the air as a healthy substitute for a long time. people come to things or the same thing in a different way. But it was one of those things I felt really awful. Like, oh no, I totally did not mean to copy this woman's recipe. And it's not at all word for word, but I can see why somebody would say like, that's her recipe.
Well, I guess that will come down to the style, the ingredients, the process, the method. And that's all things that you're also doing as somebody, a cookbook author who's developing recipes. You're also writing that all in. But you're right. There's some things that are just in the air. I mean, hey, chocolate chip cookies, refrigerating the dough. There's a lot of people who came to the terms that making chocolate chip cookies, it's better to refrigerate the dough overnight. But now it's just a big thing. And it's like, was that one person the first person? Probably not. But it's okay. Like, as long as we're not calling people out for stealing that idea. One thing I wanted to get into is, let's say we have these recipes in development. Maybe we're not finished with all of our recipes for our cookbook, but we have a nice stack. What is the difference between recipe development and recipe testing? How does the testing work when you are working on cookbooks? I mean, Andrea, we've talked a little bit in past episodes about how you work with testers, but at what point do you get testers involved?
It gets to the point where I'm feeling like, yeah, I'm there. I'm ready for prime time and things are working. I have all my cues in there. I have my, I have a head note and all that stuff. And I send it off to them.
So you have a head note at that point?
Oh, yeah. My recipe testers are all volunteers. And I see them as like, your average home cooks, and they need to know why they're making something. They also help me edit. So they will literally tell me, yeah, that doesn't sound that good, or there's a typo. And I ask for that information from them in addition to testing the recipes themselves. And I have a rubric that they can answer or not. But they walk through the recipes and then they send feedback. But the thing is that is testing. That is like having someone go blindly, just tackle the recipe as if they're cooking it in the printed version. If there's an issue, then I go back and I tackle it myself with fresh eyes. Because, there's a certain point where you're like, looking at a recipe and you've baked that cake 30 times and you just need help. That's what recipe testers are for. They're my first line of, frankly, editing as well. It can be a daunting, humiliating task sometimes when they point out misspellings and you're like, oh man, but it is a 65,000 word document, that manuscript. Keeps me humble, keeps me honest, but recipe testing is not the same as developing. It's you're opening yourself up to scrutiny.
Well, that's a really good point. What you're saying is that they are taking the recipe as you've written it and just taking it through the progressions. They're not changing anything. They're not saying, I'm going to add 1 cup of rice instead of half a cup because I just feel like this will make this recipe better. They're not doing that. They just have to do it exactly how you've written it. And that's the big difference between developing. It's not quite as cut and dry. You're not asking the testers to make your recipe better. You just want them to be your beta reader, your beta cook.
Yeah, sometimes you do that. And sometimes you guys, like my recipe testers, some of them have been with me for years and they off-wrote it. And
off-wrote it.
They'll be like, I didn't have this, so I tried that, but I'll do it again. So they'll sometimes just voluntarily like double test for me.
That's cool.
Especially during the pandemic when it was so difficult to get ingredients and stuff. And they would try things. And sometimes they wouldn't read all of my directions and they'll use a different quality of ingredient and they'll come back and they'll say, I didn't have that quality of rice paper you specify. So I tried something else. And you were right. It was like really hard. But here is a solution. So they actually help my recipes be better.
That's cool.
That is really cool.
Great description of it. I worked on the Best American Recipe series books for a long time. And one of the things I learned from that experience is that a recipe that you can off-road and still work in many ways is the best kind of recipe. So I think if you had testers that would do both, like follow it, verbatim the way we expect our recipe tester to do it, but also to take it in another direction, it still works. That's a recipe you want to keep, one that you really can't screw it up even if you try.
I worked with testers for Modern Potluck, and one thing it taught me actually is to work with testers who are going to be in the audience for your book. So that book, it's certainly not advanced, but it's for people who are used to cooking and used to cooking with a lot of whole ingredients. And then there was a woman who tested for me who was very nice, but she wanted everything to be like, can't you just get the canned version of this or that? I was like, okay, she's not my audience. So I appreciated her feedback, but I took some of it with a grain of salt. Speaking of salt, I think she also wasn't using salt.
Oh,
yeah, even though that was my suspicion, because like just the way some of the feedback was. Because it was almost like, can't you add this salty sauce?
I use a range of testers. So I have...
That's smart.
I sometimes I'll send the same recipe to different testers to see same thing. Somebody who, some, I don't have like Andrea, I don't have a flanks of unpaid testers, but I do have some volunteer testers, and then I have some paid testers that I work with. And I use a worksheet for everybody gets the same worksheet. And the first thing, you have to give it a grade. And if it doesn't get an A+, it doesn't work. But I put all the grades up there because I do want to know. Like if you're going to give it a B or a B+, even I need to know that. So it has an actual grade. And then is it worth the effort is the second question. Because remember, these are my recipes, so some of them are long. And I want to know, is it worth the effort? Because that's the second thing. Like if it's a complicated recipe, but it delivers big, okay, that's fine. There's place for it. But if it's a complicated recipe and you say, meh, then I need to know that too. So those are the two questions I always ask at the top. And then I have some more specific questions. But every recipe comes back with a worksheet.
That's great. I work with this one person who loves baking for baking testing. And she had the best feedback for a baklava recipe for the lavash book, where I had this complicated thing. You had to have 3 balls of dough and they had to be different sizes. And one had to be smaller and one had to be larger. And then there was a middle one. She had a clever way of, instead of me saying 65 grams for this and 85 grams for this and 55 grams, she's like, what if you just pinch off a little bit from one of them and put it on the other one, and that'll be the bigger one. And then the other ball will be smaller, and you keep one in the same. Then you got, and I was just like, wow, thank you. Because she was getting confused reading how I had written the recipe. So yeah, testers are really fabulous, great people. And I would say that if you are new to the cookbook world and you want to get your feet wet and you just want to be involved, asking to test recipes, maybe a couple of recipes just to sort of get a feel for what goes into a recipe test is a great way to make connections in the cookbook world. So with that, I think we have so much to say about recipes, and I want to continue all the recipe conversations. We're definitely going to talk more about head notes and recipe style and what a style guide is and how you write your recipes. Is it 1 tablespoon? Is it 1 TBSP period? But for now, I think the key takeaways are, make sure you're looking at your recipe list, you're developing your recipes, and you're going into your kitchen. You're just taking a lot of notes. You're gathering a lot of data, and you're keeping all that data, because when you do have your edits back, you might find out that you need to know if that yield is 1 cup and you forgot to include that in your notes, or the oven temperature was left off the recipe and you need that in your notes. So keep all your notes. We'll worry about the specifics on the style of what those recipes look like later in a different episode. And finally, recipe testers are valuable and we need them in the cookbook world more than ever. All right. Let's do lightning round. Okay, so when you're writing a book, you could be a plotter or a pantser, someone who writes by the seat of your pants. I feel like in recipe testing, and developing, we're sort of plotters and pantsers. We're like plotting out the recipes, but we go in the kitchen and we start pantsing and go, oh, I forgot, actually using this spice in here is going to make all the difference in this recipe. So I think it's a little bit of a balance. Molly, I'm going to start with you this time. What's the one key thing that someone should think about when they are starting their cookbook recipe writing process?
You really got to get in there and cook your pants off, as you be a plotter and a pantser, but just
cook your pants off.
And as you said, take the notes. Step by step, it's work, it's putting in the work, but the inspiration that's going to come from that cooking, it's going to light your book on fire. That's where it comes from. So you really do need to do the cooking.
Awesome. Kristin?
Anne Lamott wrote that book, Bird by Bird, about writing and taking it step by step. So it's just recipe by recipe, because it can be so daunting when you're looking at that list. And for me, that's what the spreadsheet helps with. It's like I give myself these they're like false deadlines, but okay, this month I'm going to focus on these recipes. But when I can know like the tiny step that I need to take that week or that day, it just helps with the overwhelm of the whole project. It's like, all I got to worry about is this recipe.
Such a good point. Andrea, what do you got for us?
You know, the recipes are the trees and the books the forest. And I gotta always be looking at both, because sometimes those onions, even if I'm wearing my contact lenses, you guys, I'm still gonna be crying at my keyboard.
And I'll say that your mom is also going to ask you, why do you say scallions? Because it doesn't say that at the store.
Yes, my mother, there are people who will always keep you true. And mothers are one of them.
I love it. And I will say, just make sure you write down more information when you're developing recipes than you think you need. There'll be always something that you just didn't think you needed to know at that time. You can always cut that information out later, but it's really hard to find it. You'll actually have to just redo everything. Get your scale out, weigh it all, even if you don't use weights in your recipes at the end. Just, gather your information. So these were awesome tips. Thank you all. And we have one last tidbit before we wrap up today. We want to talk a little bit about something we learned from a book, either about recipe writing or just cooking in general, or just a source of inspiration. Molly, I think you have one for us this week, right?
Yeah, I do. And I wanted to share with you a book called Colombiana by Mariana Velasquez. It's a source of inspiration for me. And I don't know if it came at a time when I needed inspiration, but it's really funny because I wanted to share this with you. I hadn't realized it'd be the context of this conversation, but it's sort of beautiful that it is, because this book is like a love letter to Mariana's home country, Colombia. And Mariana is a food stylist, and it is such a beautiful book. It's almost like there's something, I don't know, film-like. There's this lushness to it. There's just, lots of photographs, and it's not my kind of book. It's very lifestyle-y, but I find so often that lifestyle books, that's all they are. But this is a book that's filled with warmth and context. It's elegant, it's lush, but it's also crammed with information, and you really do learn about the food. And I think one of the things that makes it so warm and weighty is that when they were going to shoot the book, the photographs for it, they had a plan to go to Colombia and travel around in 10 days and do all the photographs there. And then the pandemic hit and they couldn't. And so they had to film it in Brooklyn and in upstate New York. And something about that longing, Gentle and Hires did the photography for it. Pretty sure Mariana did the food styling. And it's a magical book. And yet it's not just beautiful. It's filled with story and memory and nostalgia, and the recipes. I'm just really taken with so many of the recipes as well. There's things like there's playlists and there's cocktails. And like I said, it's things that I wouldn't put in a book, or I wouldn't think would really move me so much. But anyway, it's one that's really been bringing me a lot of joy right now.
I think I'm going to buy that for myself right now.
Molly, thanks so much for sharing that beautiful book. And we will put a link to that book in our show notes, as well as, Kristin, I might have to ask you to share your spreadsheet in for our show notes as well, because that sounds pretty helpful.
It's a good idea.
And on that note, we're signing off from another episode of Everything Cookbooks. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kate.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have questions or comments, ping us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks, or send us a message at everythingcookbooks.com. Thank you to our editor, Abby Cerquitella. And if you have a few seconds to spare, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, which will help more people find the show. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.